Having finished up the entire decade in this series, we'll now be continuing the series in a slightly different way. As I mentioned in my last video, we'll now be picking and choosing certain historical drafts that may stand out as fairly significant in the league's history. This could be because it featured several future stars, included some significant moves for certain franchises, or maybe even they featured some all-time bad picks. For today's video, we'll be beginning this historical rewind with the class of 2003, and I think many of you already know the significance of this class. As always, we'll be going through every pick made in the lottery and giving a grade to the picks made, but I'm also going to be a bit stricter with the grading because while every all-star has been getting an A+ grade in videos past, that won't necessarily be the case anymore. Before we start though, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as all support is very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. Starting off with the first pick in this draft, the Cleveland Cavaliers got the man that would single-handedly change their franchise forever, being LeBron James. LeBron had been a national sensation for years at this point, having taken the world by storm by dominating the high school scene from the moment he stepped on the court. He was the prize of the lottery, with several teams praying they would win the rights to the first pick, and when Cleveland came out on top, it almost seemed too good to be true. He'd be staying home in his home state to lead the franchise back to relevance, and in pretty much every way imaginable, he lived up to the hype and more. He's won almost every individual award imaginable, he's put up historic numbers on a yearly basis, is arguably the most well-rounded player of all time, and even delivered on his promise to bring a ring home to the city of Cleveland. He's undoubtedly one of the greatest players to ever step foot on a basketball court, and has become one of the biggest names in all of sports. So I think it's pretty safe to say that this was an A+ of a pick. Next up, with the second pick in the draft, the Detroit Pistons made a mistake that would haunt the franchise for years to come by taking Darko Milicic. The Pistons at this time were contenders on the cusp of winning a championship, and even though they would go on to bring a ring home to the city of Detroit with Milicic, it certainly wasn't in any way because of his contributions. Milicic is the sore thumb that sticks out in the middle of the top 5 of this draft, because every other pick made is a future Hall of Famer, and Milicic's impact on the league was as minimal as it gets. Despite getting taken second overall, he was essentially a bench warmer in his entire Detroit career. His promising skill, size, and wingspan never actually developed into a productive player on the court, and had the Pistons selected one of the next 3 players we'll discuss, they may have had a longer reign at the top of the Eastern Conference. This pick, without question, gets a grade of an F, and is definitely one of the biggest regrets a team can make in a draft. Next up, with the third pick in the draft, the Denver Nuggets selected Carmelo Anthony. Carmelo had just led his Syracuse team to a college national championship, and with his draft stock sky high and nothing else to accomplish, he declared knowing he would be one of the top 3 picks. Obviously, he probably should have been the pick at number 2, but the Nuggets were more than happy to take him at 3, and his time spent in Denver was very successful. At his peak, Carmelo Anthony was one of the toughest players to defend one-on-one, and the wide array of moves he had in his arsenal in isolation situations truly made him one of the best scorers in the league. Right off the bat, he was someone averaging over 20 points per game as a rookie, and that continued for 14 straight seasons, a feat that has only been outdone by none other than Michael Jordan, who did so for 15 straight seasons. Melo has caught a lot of flack in recent years for not molding his game to fit the modern NBA as he started to get older, but in his prime, he was an unbelievable scorer. So for a grade, this pick too gets an A+. Next up, with the fourth pick in the draft, the Toronto Raptors selected Chris Bosh. Now, this was obviously a very strong pick for the Raptors, and Bosh was one hell of a player for most of his career. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I am going to be a bit more strict with the grading, so even though Bosh is a multiple-time All-Star and great player, he's not an automatic A+. After all, the grade stems from his tenure with the Raptors because they're the ones who drafted him, not for his entire career. On the Raptors, Bosh put up tremendous all-around numbers, averaging 22 points and 10 rebounds per game, and his face-up game in the mid-range and skill around the basket made him one of the top players in the league, but it never resulted in much team success. The Raptors only made the playoffs twice with Bosh leading the way, and both times they lost in the first round. When he teamed up with LeBron and Dwyane Wade in Miami, he definitely played a big part in the rings won during that tenure, but for a grade based on his time with the Raptors, it's only getting an A, especially knowing the Raptors passed up on the next player we're about to talk about. Next up, with the 5th pick in the draft, the Miami Heat selected Dwyane Wade. Wade slipping to the 5th pick despite being the 2nd best player in this draft class is something the Heat thank the basketball gods for every day, because from that point on, he would go on to run South Beach for over a decade. Wade's combination of speed, finesse, skill, athleticism, and pure playmaking ability have made him one of the best shooting guards to ever play the game of basketball. He has 3 rings to his name, a Finals MVP in 2006, where he completely dominated the finals at just the age of 24. He's won a scoring title, and he's accomplished so much throughout his career. You couldn't possibly have asked for a better case scenario here for the Heat, so I think the grade is pretty obvious. This too gets an A+ grade, but it also marks the end of the historic talent in the class, and now begins the part of the class most probably don't know much about. Next up, with the 6th pick in the draft, the Los Angeles Clippers selected Kaman, who wasn't bad by any means, but the Clippers are definitely pissed that the lottery resulted in them being just 1 pick outside of the historic top 5. Kaman was always a good, not great big man who did his job, rebounded well, and scored efficiently around the rim. He actually did make an All-Star game in 2010, but by no means was he an All-Star quality player any other year, so that was more of an outlier than anything else. The Clippers, who weren't exactly ever that good during his tenure with the team, and Kaman wasn't exactly the kind of player elevating the level of play. At the same time though, he was still a very good player by the standards of the NBA as a whole, so getting him in the lottery is definitely a good thing all in all. For a grade, this pick gets a nice B+, being pretty good but not great. Next up, with the 7th pick in the draft, the Chicago Bulls selected Kirk Hinrich. Like Kaman, Hinrich had a long, relatively successful career in the league, and early on with the Bulls, he was the kind of point guard who was above average and probably in a tier below the star guards of the league. He didn't dominate with speed, athleticism, or skill, but he was smart and a good decision maker. He would shoot the ball from the perimeter, and he did a bunch of the little things that teams love their leaders to do. He was a good locker room presence, he didn't try to do more than what he was capable of, and just played within himself. He averaged about 15 points and 6 assists per game in his first 5 seasons, where he was the team's starting point guard for most of it, and relative to the rest of the league, he was a middle-of-the-pack guy at the position. As for a grade, this one gets a nice B. Next up, with the 8th pick in the draft, the Milwaukee Bucks selected TJ Ford. Ford was someone who could have been much better than he was, but the injury bug struck him pretty early. He missed his entire 2nd season, and after that, he proved to be a decent player, but not the star many people thought he could be. He liked to play up-tempo and fast, attacking the basket constantly and creating well for those around him, and for a few years was pretty good at it, but the Bucks quickly moved on from him and shifted their focus elsewhere, so after 3 seasons he was traded to Toronto. Ford is a bit of a what could have been, but it's also not like he was a bust by any means. The grade for this one is once again a B like the last pick, but at full health, who knows whether it could have been an A. Next up, with the 9th pick in the draft, the New York Knicks selected Mike Sweetney, and after a bunch of very strong picks in a row, this is where things begin to fall off. Sweetney's appeal as a prospect was his ability to dominate down low because of his forceful strength, but that strength quickly became a weakness for him when he continued to gain weight and struggled with his fitness and weight. Being overweight hampered his play on the court, and he was warned that if he didn't get it under control, his career could be in jeopardy. He was only ever a bench player to begin with, but in his 4th season he was essentially only an end-of-the-bench guy, and after that, his career in the NBA was no more. It's unfortunate, but he simply just wasn't a very good player, and as a result, this pick gets an F. Next up, with the 10th pick in the draft, the Washington Wizards selected Jarvis Hayes. Hayes throughout his career was a decent scoring option off the bench for the teams he played for, and his role offensively was to space the floor with his above-average shooting stroke. His play on the court was decent, his production didn't really stand out in any ways, and if anything, he was inconsistent. He's a career 8-point-per-game guy who shoots about league average across the board, and nothing about his career necessarily stands out or is very significant, and as for a grade, this pick gets a C-, being slightly below average. Up next with the 11th pick in the draft, the Golden State Warriors selected Mickael Pietrus. Pietrus may have only been a career role player, but despite his average-looking production, he came through in a ton of big and timely moments. He was essentially a 3-and-D player at his peak, capable of knocking down threes and playing solid perimeter defense against the opposing team's best players. His intensity and motor earned the trust of those around him, and he came through when his teams needed him, most notably during the Orlando Magic's 2009 run to the finals. Unfortunately though, he signed with them as a free agent after his tenure with Golden State, so that really doesn't affect how good of a pick he was for the Warriors. Ultimately, he was a decent role player who did good in a reduced role, so for a grade, this one gets a B-. Up next with the 12th pick in the draft, the Seattle Supersonics selected Nick Collison. Collison would become a fan favorite in Seattle and then ultimately Oklahoma City after they moved the franchise, but it wasn't exactly because of his play on the court. He was a decent big man at his best who crashed the glass hard and rebounded very well and also competed hard defensively, but overall, he was just a mediocre player. His value came in the locker room and later on as a tremendous veteran presence for the young guys, and he always gave the game everything he had. Because of this, he actually got his jersey retired in Oklahoma City, because he played his entire career there and he was always a respected guy on and off the floor. This doesn't necessarily make this a great pick though, and for a grade, it gets a C. Next up with the 13th pick in the draft, the Memphis Grizzlies selected Marcus Banks, but he was immediately traded to the Boston Celtics. Now, Banks' production was about as minimal as it gets when it comes to putting up numbers in the box score, but he earned his way onto the court on the defensive end. His perimeter defense was hounding, intense, and disruptive, and Allen Iverson actually once named him as one of the toughest matchups he's had in his career. In general, though, he was essentially a specialist off the bench without bringing much else, so for a grade, the pick gets a D+. And finally, the last pick of the lottery for this class was made by the Seattle Supersonics again, and with it, they chose Luke Ridnour. This class has had a ton of point guards taken in the lottery, almost all of them being relatively mediocre, and that trend continues here. Ridnour was a starter for most of his tenure in Seattle, but he wasn't exactly one of the better starting point guards in the league. With averages of 9 points and 5 assists per game in those 5 years, he wasn't exactly a high-caliber player running the floor for the team. Once again, he's another player who wasn't bad, but also wasn't very good, so the grade is going to be subpar, resulting in a C. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below what other draft classes historically you want to see graded. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.